Hello to all our viewers. Ciao a tutti. My name is Anna Maria Villa. Welcome to Una Bella Chiacchierata, meaning a nice chat. And today, Una Bella Chiacchierata will be with award-winning author Tim Parks and with President of the New York State Order Sons and Daughters of Italy in America, Michele Cangiano Ment. I usually start with the following statement. We're going to learn about our guests' Italian family values and what is of importance to them that derives from being Italian. In this episode, we're going to take a look at Italian family values of Italians in Italy. However, Tim Parks is an Englishman living in Italy. So why ask an Englishman? Well, in part, he has lived in Italy for over 40 years and has written numerous books about Italy and Italians. And some of his acclaimed books include Italian Ways, A Season with Verona, Medici Money, An Italian Education, Italian Neighbors, two of my favorites, and his latest, The Hero's Way, Walking with Garibaldi from Rome to Ravenna, amongst others. And the other part, we'll let Tim tell us. So I'd like to welcome our guest, our special guest, Tim Parks, and our president, Michele Cangiano Ment. Hello, everybody.
Hi. Hi,
Good
Anna Maria.
morning.
Hi, Michele.
Hi, Tim.
Oh, and by the way, this is our first international interview as Tim is speaking with us from Milano, Italy. Michele, I spoke to you a little bit about Tim, and Tim, I spoke to you a little bit about the Order Sons and Daughters of Italy in America. And the fact that Michele has been focusing on Italian family values from Italian Americans, American Italians, and now to Italians in Italy, and to learn more about these values from these different perspectives. And since you've written so much about all of this, I thought you'd be, a great person to speak to and to interview. And Michele, do you want to just tell him a little bit about yourself?
I am second generation American. My maternal grandparents came from Sicily. My paternal grandparents came from Naples. They settled in New York. And so I am definitely, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And now I live outside of New York. I became a member of the Sons of Italy. This was originally called the Sons of Italy over 40 years ago. And I am now president. And I really feel very strongly about family values, that that is the core of any society. And I believe that we really have to enforce the family, the nuclear family, if you will, and the extended family. Because when I was growing up, we had an extended family that we were able to rely on. And it's not as much anymore. I mean, it's now more nuclear. And I would really like to know what's going on in Italy as to how family values play into that and play into the society as well.
Well, we're in an election campaign here in Italy right now. And if you started saying in Italy right now that you were for family values and enforcing family values, you would immediately be accused of being on the far right or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me say that, I'm very curious about the expression family values because different families obviously have different values. It seems to me what we're really talking about is the family itself as a value, as a more important value than lots of other things. And what that means is staying together and solidarity and all kinds of mutual help, helping each other to get work, looking after each other's kids and stuff like that. often substituting or making unnecessary social services and so on and so forth. But you know, the question is then, I mean, so obviously those are really lots of good values. On the other hand, it can start to mean that the family and family relations are more important than being correct, I'm paying your taxes, or than being you know, you might start promoting your family rather than somebody who is more worthy, and so on and so forth. So I think in Italy it's pretty clear that the family is still a lot more important than say in the UK where I was growing up. I mean, it's quite normal in Italy for somebody to say, oh, I can't come out today because it's my grandmother's onomastico, a saint's day, you know, and you think, oh God, you know, for heaven's sake, you know, your grandmother's saint's day is surely not that important. But, you know, it can be so. And lots of people are very much bound by requirements from home. You know, you constantly have to go to certain functions, certain anniversaries. You can't miss a christening, and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure if those are values in themselves, or whether they're simply a statement that the family is important, and that it's important for me to be a member of this family, and it's important for me because otherwise I won't get the help from my family that I might need, and so on. So there are good sides and bad sides to it, as I see. I've been married twice to Italians, okay? I've only been married twice. I married an Italian woman who I met at Harvard, and we came to live in Italy. And she was kind of escaping from her family to a degree. And then last year I married a woman from Taranto, from the south of Italy then. And again, there's a certain amount of, I mean, she's in Milan, partly not to be in Taranto, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's often a feeling of tension with people's families. They feel they have to stay in touch. They feel they have to observe all kinds of duties, really, and maybe they see the duties very positively, but they can also be quite suffocating and asphyxiating. So there's a lot of tension in Italy, I think, between people and their families, and in general between people and the organizations they associate with, because Italy is very much a society where you have to belong to things. You know, you have to belong to a group. You have to belong to, you have to have a particular football team, maybe, or a group that you went to school with, or a union. And you very much have to be part of groups in order to get on in Italy. But at the same time, you may resent the kind of pressures they put on you. So, it's a very different society from the kind of individualism you get in the UK and I think in the USA.
It was interesting when you said, when you said to me that the family is of value in itself. Can you explain that a little bit even more so?
I mean, some families want their children to get on and be doctors and professionals, and other families are extremely Catholic and moral and want their children to behave morally, and other families have much more liberal values. So, I mean, there are families which have within themselves very different values, but the idea of the family itself as a value, like, I have to respect my position in the family in relation to, the key person in the family, the father of the family, the mother of the family. I have to be worthy of the family. That is, whatever the family system of values, I have to fit into that. And if I don't, there's going to be a lot of tension. So you look at a book often the best way to look at this is just to look at the kind of stories that Italians produce. You know, if you look at Natalia Ginsburg, a book like Caro Michele, which is a kind of epistolary novel. It's a novel written in letters, and it's written in letters because the family is sort of broken up, but not broken up. Young Michele is extremely left-wing, probably involved vaguely in some terrorist organization. He's far away. He really doesn't want to go home, although he loves his family, because he just feels suffocated by them. And they exchange letters and so on. And you can feel that the existence of the family as a value is the only thing that's keeping these people together now, because they're so different. And at the same time, it's very difficult for them to get together. So it's very frequent that one member of the family is seen as particularly worthy and one member of the family is seen as particularly unworthy. But no member of the family is ever allowed to, as it were, drop out completely. So, you know, when Michele's girlfriend has no money and is pretty much out on the street, the rest of the family will look after her, even though everybody suspects that the child she has is maybe not Michele's child, you know, but she's somehow a member of the family, and even though everybody criticizes her, they have to be brought in. So one of the interesting things about Italian families is how much they criticize each other. And Natalia Ginsburg said, "I like nothing more than to hear my son insulting me, and I love insulting him," you know? And you think, you know, I've seen situations like in my wife's family, but my first wife's family, I would see situations where I thought, well, you know, for heaven's sake, these people should just stop seeing each other at this point. But the point is, they can insult each other so much precisely because there's really no question of anybody really, really leaving the family. So that's just not an issue. It's not like, oh my God, if I say this, they're never gonna speak. They're gonna speak to you again, you know, maybe unpleasantly. So the family takes on this sort of inevitability of something that you know, that goes on and on, even when some members of the family are maybe thinking it would be a good idea if it didn't. I don't know. Does that give you some sense of what I'm thinking about? So I'm not. But if you'd asked my parents, who were Anglican Protestant, my father a clergyman, if you'd asked them what family values were, they would have said, you know, sexual fidelity in marriage, just helping each other, also letting each member of the family grow in the right way that they want to grow. Nobody's going to say that in Italy. They're going to say he's got to grow in the way the family wants him to grow, you know, and so you get a lot of tension with that. You get a lot of tension in Italian family. I remember a student at the university, taught in Italian university for about 30 years. I remember a very charming young student. She was doing languages, and then just when she was about to get her degree, she dropped out. You know, and I contacted her and said, "This is ridiculous. You only got another exam to do. For heaven's sake, let's just finish it and get it over with." And she said, "Well, you know, I was only doing this degree because my father insisted I do this degree." And her father had a little business in textiles and basically had 3 daughters. The first daughter was going to be into marketing, okay? The second was into technical management. And the third was going to be in languages, so to do exports, right? So everything, absolutely everything, was based on this family business. And all the daughters seriously admired their hugely charismatic father. But this father hadn't actually given any thought to the fact that maybe they didn't actually want to do what he thought they ought to be doing. Yeah?
I think Michelle had an experience like that from, right, when your family, that I guess this must have
When
been brought over from Italy, that she was,
we were raised, and well, women normally, when I was a young child, did not go to college. It was only the men members of the family. However, I was the first that did go to college in my family. And but I was limited to becoming a teacher or a nurse because those were considered professions that were for women. If you became a doctor, it was like much too much schooling. And why should that money be invested in you? Because after all, you're probably just going to get married and have children. And so that was the nursing and the teaching, because you would be home all summer with your children, and you would be home at an early hour so that you could be home with the family. As I said, that was the feeling during while I was growing up. My parents happened to be much more progressive, although I did go into education. They were much more progressive women. My father had always said, you will get at least a bachelor's degree and be available to follow your dreams at that point. Yet my sister, who was a bassoonist, was not allowed to, because she had been offered a seat in an orchestra, and they said no. My parents felt that that was not a good life for a young woman. So that was my experience with that.
Let me tell you a funny story, which I think gets some of the sense of this. Again, it's a student story.
Mm-hmm.
I had a student who was doing a thesis with me. She was a very talented young woman, and one day she comes in, and she'd clearly been crying,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very difficult. Like, it was a tutorial situation. It was very difficult to go on with this person who was clearly in an emotional state. So I said to her, okay, look, either tell me what the problem is, or, let's adjourn to another time. So she said, it's a boyfriend problem, broken up with my boyfriend. And I said, well, okay, so happens, you get over it. And, I tried to be fair. What can you say in those situations we've all been through?
Sure.
And then she said, no, you haven't really understood. Like, we actually glad to break up, because I've been living in Milan for 3-4 years now, and he's been living in Bari, and he doesn't want to come up to the north, and I don't want to go back down to the south. She was from Bari as well. So, we just kind of realized that we're not really, in love. And we decided to call it a day. I said, so great. So, that's wonderful. You can move on from the big first relationship. I said, no, but it's my mother. So the problem was this, that the two families, and I've heard this time and again in Italy, the two families over the 5 or 6 years of this relationship had become extremely close together. And they had started planning for the future, planning for the because they were really looking forward to this marriage, and they were looking forward to the grandchildren, and the family was going to be extended, and it was going to be, all hunky-dory. And the parents had started going on holiday together, and they were choosing the flat, and they were, the whole thing. So her mother had actually had a nervous breakdown and had to go to the psychologist when the two broke up, right? So, I said, well, this looks very much to me like it's your mother's problem and not your problem, And she said, well, no, my mother's problem is my problem, It's
Right.
But at the end, and this was a funny thing, at the end, very laughingly, I said, well, I guess you'll have to get back together again then. But, you know, as a joke, I said it as a joke, thinking, and she said, yeah, we're thinking of doing that. And I was really shocked, you know. So clearly the family, you know, I had thought that this was a modern young woman, as I thought of modern, who was just gonna, no, and she's saying, no, well, maybe, you know, maybe we'll have to. So that is one aspect of the family which I tend not to see as too positive, although it can create a lot of interesting stories.
Yeah, that is interesting. Wow.
It isn't. I have recently read a book about a story like that.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
There's another great novel by Natalia Ginzburg called The Voices of the Evening, Le Voci della Sera, where this couple are having a clandestine relationship, the son of a really rich family and a girl who's a school teacher in a little village outside Turin. They're having a clandestine relationship because his family is so rich and her family's not. And finally, she gets fed up with this and says, look, I'm going to leave you. I can't go on like this. So he changes his mind and says, okay, let's get married. And they come out together. You know, we're a couple, we're going to get married. And the families are delighted. And they start to do everything, to buy everything. And then they find that the families are so overwhelming that they don't want to get married anymore. And they split up because it was just too much. So, you know, these stories are really constant in Italy, and they kind of open up a world of tensions and a world of emotions, which I think is I think the emotions are actually rather different from the way in the Anglo-Saxon world we experience.
I think that it's not as prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon world, but it does exist.
Sure. Well,
you know, I mean, you can't. I mean, when I talk about family values, though, I'm more reminiscent of being together on Sundays, having the extended family there, and just discussing what's going on during the week. But in my own case, I don't remember any true conflict of interest as to the personal beliefs and the personal endeavors that members of the family were looking to follow. I mean, I didn't see that. I don't remember it as a child. I wasn't aware of any of that kind of strife in the family, the extended family. And I'm looking at it more as a support system.
Sure.
And I would say you're right. With the support must come a certain amount of strife, that you cannot follow all of your own dreams. I mean, I know that. But that there's still a bond that holds you together.
For sure. But I think one of the problems with these things is we tend to try and decide whether something's good or something's bad. And the fact is, there are all kinds of good things and there are some bad things. And there are some families where this all works wonderfully. I know a family, friends of my present wife in Milan, a wonderful distribution of their children between their grandparents and, you know, their grandparents here in Milan for sort of everyday purposes, and grandparents down south for holiday purposes, and it all works pretty well. I know other families where, you know, you have to go every Sunday to lunch with the grandparents, and it can drive you crazy. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, these things pitch both ways. in Italy today, it seems to me that there's quite a wide range now of situations, some of which look very old-fashioned, and some of which look much more American in the way they operate. But I do think that beneath it all, there is still this sense that the key value is being included or not in the family, or indeed in other groups. Like, you have to be included in a group, hopefully your family, as a worthy member. And if by some chance the family excludes you, kind of excommunicates you for some reason, often to do with values, you know, like the question of being excluded from life, is excluded from your family, is a terrible thing in Italy. And again, an awful lot of Italian narratives tend to move around the question of who is included in the family or not. And if you look at Italian politics, it's almost never about what the program of the different parties is, you know, what they're actually going to do, but who is in the actual parties and which particular groups inside the parties they're involved in. And this party is splitting up, and that party has asked that other party to join them. And so it's all a kind of question of, you know, who belongs to which group, rather than what any of these groups are actually going to do when they get into power. So it takes quite a long time before you begin to realize what's going on in Italy. For example, one funny thing in Italy, in that group called the Movimento 5 Stelle, which was a sort of left-wing alternative group, which was very successful in the last elections. And they had a system online where all the members could vote on the inclusion or exclusion of any other member. So they were constantly having these votes where if somebody misbehaved, the membership would vote to exclude them or not. You know, a kind of thing that you can't imagine that going on too much in the Anglo-Saxon world.
Has politics become, or is it a family value in Italy? I mean, because politics is so entrenched in everything that they do.
Politics is quite tribal. So, and a tribe is an extended family, if you like. So often people won't change positions simply because they feel they belong to this or that sort of wider group, you know, the center left, or you know, or the center right. And then very often your major politician will present himself as a father figure, you know, a kind of padrone figure in many ways. Berlusconi is the obvious example. You know, Berlusconi always used to say that he felt he was the father of his big company. He was the father of his football team, Milan at the time. Now he's downsized to Monza. And then when he became prime minister, you know, he wanted to think of himself as the father of Italy, as it were. Which, you know, if you go back in Italian history, you find Cosimo de' Medici in the early 15th century being talked about as the father of Florence, you know, and of the Florentines. So there's this constant desire to have any group be a kind of family, which means that it works on a hierarchical basis with a father at the top and children at the bottom. And the children can misbehave, but you love them all the same because they're children up to a point, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think family values, or the family as a value, is constantly getting mixed up with other groups in Italy. Let's try and get this straight.
Mm.
It's clear that when you move into a different group, you know, you'd be crazy to not start, to a certain extent, adapting your behavior because you're in a different world. You know, it's like when you're changing climate, you better change the clothes you're wearing, you know. So when in Rome, do as the Romans, to a certain extent. And the Italians have this expression, what is it? Inglese italianizzato, uomo indiavolato, or something like that. Like an English person in Italy is more dangerous than an Italian person because he loses the values that came from home, but he doesn't actually get the values that we've got here.
I think just that when my grandparents migrated to the United States, they brought with them the values that they grew up with. Now, as we assimilated, we of course, I don't know, sometimes diluted, sometimes entrenched those values. But that was almost like a capsule in time. Those values remained with them, where the Italian values have changed, have modified over the years, where our value basically has maintained itself the way it was presented. And then as we assimilated, we then did it in a more American way, or the communities that we lived in, whether we lived in an Italian neighborhood or an Irish neighborhood. We sort of ended up assimilating a lot of the values there as well. Am I understanding what you're saying as far as how our values?
You know, it's, I mean, there's just lots of literature about, particularly about immigrant communities where you get a large number of people emigrating, that they tend to become very attached to the older value system together. And they don't realize that maybe back in the home country, everything's changing. And so you get this little enclave. You know, I remember the North End in Boston, back when I was studying in Boston in the 1980s, the North End looked like something from, you know, 50, 60 years ago, in 50, 60 years previously. But let's just say this. In America, particularly, almost all stories that you read, like novels, major films, they're almost all basically about winning or losing. Okay, about coming out on top or not coming out on top, and also then about being good or being bad. Like, you can be a winner, but if you're also a good winner, a good person, then you're even more of a winner. So that, for example, an American entrepreneur who makes a lot of money starts giving away money to his college, or, like, you know, if you're Bill Gates, you can just give money away to everybody. So there's this idea of the American dream as me reaching, you know, being a huge success and reaching the top, and also being a good person, like a morally good person. Okay, so there's somebody who's successful, but he's not good, is not really quite so successful, and you know that at the end he will be killed or in some way get his comeuppance. So, but in Italy, stories are not so much about that. I mean, and for example, an extremely rich Italian doesn't become a major benefactor. I mean, who does Berlusconi give money to? He gives money to his old girlfriends, his extended family, the people in his companies. So an Italian padrone uses his money and wealth to enhance his family, not to become an altruistic benefactor for the whole world. It's much, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's just not the normal thing. So American stories are very much about winning and losing, also about losing, but losing well, you know. all the things about the sort of beat generation, where you drop out of society because the kind of winning that official society presents doesn't attract you. So you want to be a winner in a different way, and you get into a world of Jack Kerouac and so on and so forth. Really, so if you want, like, if you, Anna Maria, if you want to separate those differences, you have to say, when there's a real dilemma, like what matters is being successful or being part of the family and part of the group. Okay. When you get to that point, which way do you come down, you know?
Right. In Italy, it's more family first.
Is it more important for you to, you know, to get on, or you know, to feel that that you behave like, would you rather your children, don't know if you have children, would you rather your children, you know, were hugely successful, or that they stayed in the family and in all their place, you know? So I think that's the kind of area where we're looking at differences. I read 2 or 3 stories coming out of America about entrepreneurs who didn't want to leave all their money to their children because they wanted their children to have to struggle and get on as they did. This is unimaginable. This is unimaginable. And also, you read conversely. I remember I was talking with Eleonora here, my wife, about a situation in England where somebody we knew had refused to go and pick up their child from the airport because they felt it was a ridiculous request with all the public transport there was, and given the distance and so on, you know. And Eleonora just said, you know, that's, you know, in our family, if they ask you to pick you up at the airport, even if it's a nightmare, and even if you think it's really unreasonable for them to have asked you, you just do it. You just do it anyway, and maybe you feel really stupid doing it, but you do it. And I remember in a book called Italian Life, I told a long story, which is a true story. I mean, I'll try and tell it quickly. It's a very funny story, really. This guy down in Taranto was invited to a friend's wedding, except that he wasn't invited directly. He was invited through his ex-wife. Okay. Now, he objected to being invited through his ex-wife. He felt his ex-wife, you know, he felt he should have been invited directly. And his ex-wife said to him, anyway, if you go, our daughter won't go because I don't want her to meet your new partner. Okay. So he decided not to go to this wedding. At the same time, his aunt, who also knew the guy, was invited to the wedding, and she was a nun, and she lived 250 miles away. So he had, in order not to go to the wedding, but not to seem like he was just not going to the wedding, he had booked a holiday in Yugoslavia. But the aunt asked him to take her to the wedding. So he drove 250 miles, picked the aunt up, drove her 250 miles to the wedding, drove another 100 miles to the airport, and flew to Yugoslavia to avoid the wedding. I was just completely crazy. You know, instead of just saying, you know, hey, you should have asked me directly. Prevalent. Also, but notice that one thing that's changed enormously is the mobile phone. And what the mobile phone means is, and cheap phone charges, what that means is that people are on the phone all the time to their families. So I know one guy in Milan who finally broke up with his girlfriend. They were both from the South because she was always on the phone to her mother and grandmother, you know, I mean, just always. I mean, just like at dinner time, you know, just like 5, 6 phone calls every day, long phone calls, just became impossible. So distance has been kind of slightly eliminated by the mobile phone, but at the same time, there's an awful lot of back and forth in Italy. It's amazing how much the Italians are willing to travel. even really long bus rides or car rides. You know, north south is 1,000 kilometers.
So that's still a strong bond.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the trouble with a conversation like this, obviously, you know, there's a lot of simplification. I mean, obviously, there are examples of people not behaving like that. But a person who doesn't speak to their family once a week is considered, you know, like, but my wife has a lot of trouble understanding that everything's absolutely fine with me and my kids, even though we may talk to each other 4 or 5 times one week and then not at all for a month or two, you know. And it's completely cool, and everybody's happy, and nobody's going to pick up the phone and say, why haven't you phoned me, you know. So it's different like that, and I think the families do keep in very close contact. And there is also still this very big question of who my children marry, you know. Like, if you look back at Italian stories from the distant past, like you get a copy of that wonderful book, The Fables of Basile. Basile was a writer in the 16th century who wrote fables. What are they called? Il conto dei conti, or actually in Neapolitan, il conto dei conti. And almost all these stories, the fables, are stories about a daughter choosing the wrong husband, or choosing the right husband but the family objects, or you know, the wrong person coming into the family, and so on and so forth. So, for example, one of my daughter's friends in Verona recently, she had a boyfriend from Yugoslavia. I don't know whether he was Serbian or, but he had come over when Yugoslavia was Yugoslavia. And he didn't have a particular job. He would do a lot of manual jobs, but he didn't have a particular profession. And that was kind of okay until she decided to marry him. And then the family just said, no, you know, we're not gonna help. We're not gonna buy the rings. We're not gonna do anything to help you, because they just didn't want this figure from outside into the family. So the two of them emigrated to the USA, you know, living in New York. But funny enough, that was very funny too, because I said, so why are you going to New York? This is one of my daughter's old friends. I knew her quite well. And she said to me, well, we have an uncle in New York.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you were raised, and what made you move to Italy?
Well, I was born in the north of England. My father is an evangelical clergyman. My mother was very much on board. I was the youngest child of 3. My parents got very seriously involved in the charismatic movement when I was in my teens, in the kind of swinging 60s. So our house was full of things like exorcisms and speaking in tongues and so on and so forth. I was very eager to escape all this. And, you know, I went to university in the UK, and then I got a scholarship to Harvard. And that was where I met Rita, who was my first wife. And she came to England for a few months after we were in the States, and then we decided to go to Italy. I think what happened to me in Italy was, you know, it is that you feel immediately it's a completely different set of values, and that's very liberating at first, because, you know, because all those kind of values in which people were judged and criticized in the UK just disappeared. So you feel pretty good about that, but you don't realize that there's a whole other set of values that, you know, you're going to have to learn how to deal with. So at first it was fun. In fact, I wrote a sort of thriller, a noir, a book called Cara Massimina, about a British guy who comes to Italy and becomes a criminal because he becomes a rather dangerous person just because he feels that all his old home values have gone, you know. So I think also one of the interesting things when you marry somebody from a different culture, and you see them in relation to your own culture, you know, you see where their position is inside the group of people, you know, and then you go to the other culture and you see that they have a completely different position there, and you know, the whole dynamic is rather different from, you know, the dynamic between you changes. Very high rate of divorce between people who meet in one country in one language and move to another country, move to the country of the other partner. I think it's 7 times higher than the normal divorce rate.
Oh, wow.
Well, we lasted 30 years, so that's pretty good, I think.
That's
But that's, you know, sort of a draw, I think. But
Did
so
you have a daughter? Do you have other children?
I have 3 children. Yeah. I mean, again, that's interesting. I have a son and 2 daughters. The 2 older children, I mean, they were all brought up in Italy. They all did Italian schools. They all studied for Italian degrees. And then Michele went to the UK, where he works in molecular biology in the UK, and he didn't want to go to the UK. He went to the UK because in his field, if you really didn't know somebody very well, it was almost impossible to get funding and to move on, you know. Whereas I said to him, try the UK. He said, I don't know anyone. I said, you don't need to know anyone. You just need to give a good interview, you know, and show some good research. And he got 3 or 4 offers in the UK. So he stayed there, though I think he would very much have liked to come back. My older daughter also went to the UK because, again, you see, one of the things with the family system is that you're always young until you're really quite old, you know, in Italy. I mean, you're a young person in Italy until you're like 45, you know, because you're always a son or you're always a daughter. And so everything happens more slowly. You know, a doctor doesn't become a major, you know, isn't going to start doing major operations until probably he's in his 30s, you know. Whereas, you know, in America, a really smart young person is going to be in the operating theatre in his mid-20s, probably. The result of all that is that there's a lot of emigration out of Italy by young people who don't have good contacts and who are very bright, just to get jobs, you know. So the American universities are full of excellent Italian PhD students, and likewise the UK. So you know, and that's also attached. It is attached to the whole family thing and to the whole feeling that promotion comes by seniority, which is still very, very strong in Italy. Just like fatherhood comes with seniority, you know, and a grandfather has to be respected because he's grandfather, which is good, but maybe not if you start moving it into a business setting.
Mm-hmm.
What about the living at home, as opposed to here? Usually they're wanting to get you out on your own, independent. In Italy, you live home for as long as you can or until you get married. Has that changed at all?
You know, I think that's changing actually in England, where people are staying at home longer, but
I think that's all over.
right, yeah. But no, people stay at home really quite late here. Or they have an early marriage and then they go back home. That's quite normal too.
You mean together as a couple, or?
No, like they have an early marriage that goes wrong. I mean,
Oh, that goes wrong and then go home.
You know, and then they go back home. There are all kinds of situations where people go on living at home, and often that can be a cause of huge tension. You know, I know friends who have been just desperately eager to get their kids out of the house, and others who are desperately unhappy when the kids go. It's probably true everywhere, but for example, at the university, I remember in the UK, it was always understood that you used the university to get out of home. So when you got to 18, 19, you were desperate to go to university because then they give you a place to live for 3 years. And in that time, you would become independent. Whereas here, there's a lot more commuting. You go to the university, you maybe have to get a room for 5 days, but then you go home. And many of the students go to the university near home so that they don't have to live away from home.
I traveled like an hour and a half both ways for a while until I roomed up with 5 other girls in in an apartment in
Yeah.
L'Aquila back then. So yeah, that's interesting. L'Aquila,
Wow.
when
Yeah.
before the earthquake.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, obviously, yeah. The
Yeah.
earthquake.
Oh God. But
Let me say this: when I arrived in Italy in 1881 in Verona. I was living slightly out of town. At that time, most conversations around you were in dialect. The Veronese dialect is can be quite impossible to understand for somebody who just understands regular Italian. So I remember a phone call, for example, when I'd been in Italy for about a year and a half, and I was phoning up the electricity company because there were constant blackouts. And with the computers we had in those days, you used to lose all your work, So I was phoning up to say, guys, should I be working today or not? And the guy was replying to me in, really a dialect that was really pretty nearly impossible to understand. And, I had to say to him, for God's sake, you must be aware that I'm a foreigner. I mean, I'd only been in Italy a couple of years. I obviously had an accent. For Christ's sake, can't we speak in at least in Italian, or in Veronese with an accent, but not with. So that was quite common. That wouldn't happen today. It really wouldn't happen today. You call the electricity company today, you can be pretty sure they'll answer in Italian. And the fact that, you see, dialect, again, is part of a belonging society where you indicate you're part of a group because you can speak that local dialect. When you come from a different town, you don't try to learn that dialect, or not really to be proficient in it. Like, you can learn Italian, but you can't learn to be a real Neapolitan. Or, do you see what I mean? So that there's always a distinction between the guy who came. I remember my neighbor in Montorio, which is a little village just outside Verona. She said to me, I really understand the difficulty you're having because, I come from Peschiera, which is like 30 kilometers away, And I'm thinking, well, that's a bit different. But she said, I can't speak the local dialect, and they don't want you to speak the local dialect. Maybe a couple of words for a joke, but but the dialect is dying out. Certainly around the cities, it's dying out. If you go into the country, much less so. The TV has been a major issue. People, ever since social media began, people love to text or post in dialect, again, to show that they're part of a group. But I certainly, in Milan in particular, you really very rarely, Milanese dialect, you don't really hear in Milan. You maybe hear it a little bit out in the north to the suburbs. It was funny. I was just in Canton Ticino in Switzerland, the Italian part of Switzerland, and the dialect is incredibly strong there because, of course, the dialect in Canton Ticino is official Swiss Italian. So it has a kind of official status that dialect doesn't have in Italy. And so everybody's speaking in this dialect, which is pretty damn incomprehensible, actually. You have to really struggle to. When I wrote a book about Italian football fans, which wasn't really about football or even about fans, but just about Italians and the way they get together and so on. And that was because I'd had a season ticket at the Verona football stadium for many years. And so I traveled with the fans for a season, entirely every single game with the same group. And they all spoke dialect to each other. Like, that was part of being a Verona football fan, was that you spoke the dialect. Like, if you didn't, you were still a welcome guest, really welcome, very, very welcome guest, but you were a welcome guest. You're not going to go any
How do,
further, you know.
how do you speak with your children? I mean, since they speak both English
Well,
and
with my daughter who's in Verona, I tend to speak Italian because she's speaking Italian all the time. And with my children who are in England, and they've been in England for a while now, I tend to speak English with them when they're in England, and I speak Italian to them when they're in
when they come, when they're in it.
when they're in Italy. But honestly, I'm not really very careful. I change all the time. I mean, here
My sister lives in Celano, in Provincia dell'Aquila in Abruzzo, and she, when her and I speak, we kind of chop things up, and a little bit of a dialect, a little bit of English, a little bit of
you can't
Italian.
remember a word in one language, or it comes out better in the other. It's a bit of a problem actually when you're doing presentations. Like when you're giving a public thing, you have to keep remembering
What language you're in.
what language you're in. I know it's also, as a guy who writes novels and stuff, sometimes you're trying to put into a novel a conversation you had with somebody years ago or that you overheard. And I realized I can't remember what language the conversation was in, but I remember the contents of the conversation, and I'll be writing it down in English and I'll think, yeah, but this must have actually taken place probably in Italian, so that's a very curious thing.
Yeah,
Probably means I don't speak either language really that well, but
somebody once told me I was colingual because I think in Italian, I think in English. And if you learn something in English, chances are you're going to recall it in English. And if you learn something in Italian, you'll recall it in Italian, which maybe also if you learned it in dialect, I don't know. But it's really an interesting.
Yeah, like for example, the language of parenthood. Like we had our kids in Italy. My wife was obviously Italian. So all the first year speaking to them, all the stuff about nappies and baths and counting their little tootsies and so on and so forth was all in Italian. I remember when we went to the UK and I was making a big effort to speak to them in English, and we'd just gone on holiday and I just couldn't think of all the damn words, and I just didn't know the words for all this stuff in English. So that can happen as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. As I said, these are my favorite books, An Italian Education and Italian Neighbors.
How can I purchase those books? Because
Yeah.
Yeah,
and this one is the latest one.
I have this, the Heroes.
Yeah, they should be, you can get them through a bookshop. They're still in print. So
on Amazon as well.
Amazon, you can get them, yeah.
Yeah, and also this is your latest book, right? The Hero's Way, Walking with Garibaldi from Rome to Ravenna. And we have something called the Garibaldi Meucci Museum, and Michele was.
We're going to talk about that with members of the museum.
That's a good idea, yeah. It's worth saying though that that book was really a long walk. There was a terrible moment in 1849 when they'd had a revolution in Rome, and the Pope had called in the French and the Spanish and the Neapolitans to crush it. And Garibaldi was in Rome defending Rome, and it became impossible. And he left Rome with about 4,000, 5,000 volunteers. And he tried to reach Venice, where there was another revolution, another republic. And he had to sort of zigzag all over Italy because there were Austrian armies and there were French armies. And me and Eleonora, we decided to reconstruct the walk they did, which was about 630 kilometers. What's that? About 400 miles, just a bit short of 400 miles. And we tried to walk it at the same time they walked it, which was in July, and it was hot, and in the same number of days. So it's really a book about modern Italy and walking through modern Italy, but also about these people who made Italy, and their beliefs, like they really believed in the nation state. Whereas now, if you say you believe in the nation state now, like if you say you believe in family, Michele, you'll be accused of being far right, you know?
Oh,
You'll be accused of being a sovranista. A sovranista is somebody who believes that Italy should have, you know, run itself rather than be run by the EU or in association with the EU. So, you know, it was a book about really it's a wonderful story, because the story of that Garibaldi story is just a fantastic gift to a storyteller. And it's also a story about modern Italy and what it feels like walking through these tiny communities, which are lots of them totally abandoned in the center of Italy. And then again, this feeling of, you know, what is the Italian nation now in this European sort of hodgepodge, you know? So that was what that book was about. It was a lot of fun to write that book.
the Sons and Daughters of Italy, we're a grassroots organization that's about, thousands of members across the United States. In New York, we have close to 6,000 members.
Wow.
And it has to do with how that we are trying, we believe strongly in our culture and our heritage, and about the contributions that Italians and Italian Americans have made to this country, to the United States. But we do have a chapter, what we call a lodge, in Rome. And now we are forming, and it should be formed probably around October, in southern Italy, possibly around Palermo. So that there will be a second lodge of the Sons and Daughters of Italy. One of the
You're a family.
Our family, our extended
belong
family.
Together.
Yes. And one of the things that we in the United States are involved in is that people are trying to do away with Columbus Day.
Do away with Columbus Day?
Yes. And we
of course, okay, I get you.
You know, they're saying that he was a murderer and a rapist, and and in reality, we know that he was a man of his time, and he brought in, he brought the one hemisphere to the other, and that's because he's responsible for opening up the Western Hemisphere. So people, but they don't see him as a man of his time. They see him,
you know,
by today's standards.
Let's not get into that culture politics.
Right.
And, you know, I wonder when they're going to start finding a reason to pull down statues of Garibaldi, but I hope not. I haven't been able to think. I haven't been able to think of any misbehavior bad enough for them to start doing that. But you know, funnily enough, talking about the Garibaldi Meucci Museum, Garibaldi went to the USA because when he finished this long escape from Rome in 1849, when he managed to, I mean, really, his whole army had to break up, and he lost his wife who died and on the trip, and he became a fugitive, but he managed to escape. And nobody wanted him in Italy because he was such dangerous property, because people were always trying to start revolutions around him. So he emigrated briefly to the USA, where he worked in Staten Island in a factory of an old friend. He worked in a candle factory in Staten Island for a while before being given a ship. So, and he lived
with Meucci.
See you again. So the presence of Garibaldi in the USA was what was followed this story in the hero's way, you know. And later, I remember in 1861, can't remember exactly, Garibaldi was invited to be a general in the American Civil War. He was actually invited by the president. And he said he would only do that if the president would guarantee that slavery was the key issue of the war and that slavery will be banned everywhere. And at that point, the president wasn't willing to make that commitment. And so Garibaldi refused to go because he would only go on that basis. So,
wow, that's
he was very curious. He was a very curious guy, a very interesting guy.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on in this episode, and definitely we'd love to have you back. Michele?
Yes.
Final words?
It was a pleasure meeting you.
And you, Michele, and you. It's good to hear about that distant past and those values being brought over from Italy so long ago. And you know, the whole family value thing is the fact that you guys still feel you need to have this association and sort of keep it going.
It's interesting because we have a slogan that says Italian roots, American branches.
Oh, very nice.
So it's a slogan that was recently came about.
Very nice.
We look forward to having you back, and hopefully with the museum. I think that's going to be really a lot of fun. And once again, thank you so much. And to all our viewers, make sure that you go to Amazon and pick up his latest books. He's got so many more. He even did one on the Medici Bank, right? So that one I want to read as well. It's fascinating to me. But thank you so much.
Money. It's called Medici Money.
Medici Money, yeah, because they started it, right? So, Michele, thank you so much. And
thank you, Maria.
It's fun to chat. Thank you so much. Thanks for the praise. It's always, embarrassing to get, but great to think about afterwards. So, thanks a lot, guys.
All right, goodbye, everybody. To our next episode. Ciao, a dopo. Thank you. We'd like to thank our viewers for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we look forward to our next episode of Una Bella Chiacchierata. A presto. Ciao.